Hello, everybody, and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Deborah Oppenheimer. I am one of the partners here at Altitude Community Law. I've been handling covenant enforcement for 20 years, so let's see if we can jump into this. On your screen, you should primarily see the PowerPoint presentation and then a small box over to the left-hand side with me. On the right-hand side, you should have a menu and you should see a private chat icon. Please use that to type in your questions throughout the presentation. Those that are current with where we're at in the presentation, I'll go ahead and answer at that time. Otherwise, I'll wait to the very end and use the time to answer questions. If you have any audio or video issues during the presentation, please click the no audio or video button below the PowerPoint on your screen and follow the instructions. One CMCA credit will be automatically generated and emailed to you within about 48 hours after the webinar, assuming you attend the entire program. The credits aren't transferable, but we get a list who showed up and who didn't, and you'll get that at the end after you've been through the whole presentation. Save the image of the certificate that is in the body of the email if you want to preserve the image. To save the certificate, right-click on the image in the email and save it as a photo. The image of the certificate in the email will only be available for 30 days, or you can print the email so that you can save it. The presentation will be recorded and added to Altitude YouTube channel within a couple days. Lastly, there is a survey at the end of and it just pops up, and we really appreciate any feedback that you can give us, any thoughts, opinions, or classes that you're looking for. Please go ahead and let us know that information. As you can see, I've picked snow because I'm tired of the heat and I'm wishful thinking. They tell us that we might get snow November 1 because, you know, Halloween, right? Anybody who's ever seen one of my classes sees this presentation. I always remind everybody where you can find information because, again, we try and keep stuff available for everybody. It's a great resource. We hope you use it. We hope you utilize it. We try and make it as user-friendly as possible so that you can find the answers you need. Remember, whenever you're doing any of this, whether it's ARC, whether it's a letter, it's a violation, sometimes you get exactly what you ask for. So be careful what you ask for because making sure that you're clear about what you're demanding can mean all the difference of actually getting a fence stained appropriately for the community and getting it painted. Look, Bob, I painted my fence. Okay, when we start on ARC applications, you have to keep in mind there's a hierarchy, right? You have to remember that no matter what's in your documents, this hierarchy always trumps, right? You could have great documents that tell you no satellite dishes, and you could be functioning and working on no satellite dishes, but federal law is going to come in and trump and tell you whether you get to prohibit satellite dishes. And so even when we're talking and drilling into ARC applications, you have got to remember that there's this hierarchy out there of things that might trump, and you have to keep that in mind at all times. Federal law, FHA law, OTARD, state law, Kiowa, they're all going to trump anything in your docs. So you got to keep that in mind. Obviously, your declaration is going to trump the plat map, or the declaration and the plat map are equal. Sorry, let me be clear. Those two are equal. That's why they're on the same line. The way Kiowa works, they actually are considered part of the same document. Then you get your bylaws, then your articles. Rules, guidelines, and policies are at the bottom. Ordinances are going to be a hit and miss depending on how they're worded. Some local ordinances actually state they do trump what you've got. Some don't. Some are just out there. That comes up a lot of times when we have questions like, hey, can I have chickens? The city ordinance just said people can have chickens. But if the ordinance just says you can have chickens, you can have this many chickens, it's not specifically calling out it's trumping a covenant. Sometimes we saw covenants that said HOAs cannot enforce this rule anymore because it's really calling out we're going to trump. So ordinance are a hit and miss where they go in the hierarchy, and you're going to have to look to your documents and the actual ordinance to know where it falls and where you should keep it in mind. Okay, So when we start talking about architectural, there's not a lot in Kiowa and the policies that are really going to kick in until, after somebody starts building, right? Most of these policies that are in place have to be in place if you want to enforce. So down the road, if they build it wrong, if we get to a point where there's violations, these things have to be in place. However, until you get to the violation portion, we don't care about these policies. Now, understand, Kiowa, question is, what's Kiowa? That stands for the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, and it is the statutes that are in place that apply to most, not all, but most communities. Section 209.5, which is where House Bill 1137, which we all hate, came out of, and it's part of Kiowa. So down the road, these things we may circle back around and go, hey, remember we told you got to have these policies? And this is why. All right. So when we're talking about the architectural review process, you need to know that part of that process actually has ended up in the statute, right? So section 302(3)B came out and said, look, here's how you have to look at these requests, right? Any decision concerning approval or denial shall be made in accordance with standards and procedures in your declaration, great. In duly adopted rules that clarify, great. And shall not be made arbitrarily or capriciously, all right? Okay, so we need to keep that in mind. And we all knew that if you've ever had any kind of challenges, because the reason that statute went into place to begin with is because we had cases. And the cases came out and said, hi, we are going to defer to the decisions of the architectural committee so long as they're reasonable, made in good faith, and not arbitrary and capricious. Okay, so this law that came down, that's been in place for quite a few years, RU came out in 1969, so it's been around a really long time, but the Colorado legislature decided we're going to actually just make that part of the statute. You cannot act arbitrarily or capriciously, okay? And it really follows the business judgment rule, which is when you guys have your association and you're working through a question and your ARC is trying to figure out what's going to happen, the courts are going to defer to the decisions of the Architectural Control Committee, Architectural Review Committee, whatever that name is, so long as they have been done in good faith. They have been done not arbitrarily, not capriciously. And so the courts have said, look, we're going to follow the business judgment rule. We are going to defer to the decisions of the ARC or the ACC so long as they are not arbitrary and capriciously, right? So how do we make sure that we're going to fall into that deferment, right? That the court is going to defer to the decisions we make. And how do we make sure that we fit in there, right? Well, we're going to make sure we fit in there and so that the court defers to our decision by creating a process that ensures we didn't act arbitrarily or capriciously so long as we follow our process, right? So we're going to make sure we're going to set up a process so that when we walk into court at the end of the day, we can say, look, Judge, we followed our declaration like the statute says we're supposed to. We followed our rules that are laid out in our improvement guidelines or in our rules and regulations. And that process is fair and that process keeps us consistent so that we're not arbitrary, we're not capricious. We followed the process. And that's the strongest way to get the court to do what you want down the road. And it also helps your board, right? How many times do you have a board come to you as a manager and say, I don't know what to do with this. How do I make this decision? And so if you have good rules, if you have good guidelines, they're going to help you and help your board act consistently all the time what's in the best interest of the community. And so you remember that you got to start with the declaration, right? And it's going to give you some guidance. Sometimes it gives you a lot of leeway. And so having good guidelines, having good rules helps you stay on track. So let's kind of digging in a little. What are we looking for? When you start creating your process, you need to open up your declaration and start looking for deadlines, okay? It's critical that you know what deadlines you have and what's the result if you miss a deadline, right? So you want to look, are there deadlines, right, for how quick you have to act? Do you have a deadline? Like, do your documents say when you get an application, you're required to give a receipt? There are some declarations out there that say owners are entitled to a receipt if you turn in architectural plans. So is there a deadline for you to give that receipt? Is there a deadline for how long you have to review it? Some documents actually say there's a deadline to review, and then there's a separate deadline to make sure the owner knows of your decision, right? So a lot of deadlines here. We've got to find these in the declaration. If they're not in the declaration, then look in your design guidelines. I've had many a time where an original community board or declarant didn't put deadlines in the declaration, but they put them in the design guidelines. And the board felt very comfortable. They looked at the declaration, no deadlines, and missed the fact they were in the design guidelines created by the declarant. So you've got to look at each of your documents, and you have to make sure they do not conflict. Because if they start conflicting, you need to clean that up. Because there's no sense adding to your headaches by having conflicting deadlines. Rules, guidelines, those are board votes. If you have conflicting deadlines between your guidelines and your declaration, clean that up, make sure there's no conflicts so that there's no confusion, right? Look to your declaration. When does your deadline start? Does it start on the day Joe Smith dropped off the application? Or does it start when Joe Smith has given you every document you need to review that submission, right? And that goes into the wording of the declaration. The declaration may state that, in fact, your 30 days or your 45 days or whatever your timeline is starts when the application is complete. But it might not say that. It might say it starts when you get it. So you need to keep track of that. You need to know the difference, and you need to look in every community, every association, because they're all going to be different. They're all dependent upon the declaration and your guidelines. They are not consistent because they're not by statute. They're by each individual document. You need to know. And you need to know what happens if you miss a deadline. Many documents talk about it's deemed approved if you go past the 30 days and don't send an answer, right? It's you can't file suit if you don't file suit before they end building. I have a lot of communities that say if you don't file a lawsuit to stop the unapproved building before they finish, you can't file suit at all. So think about some of the fences, or not fences, let's think about some of the roofs that you've seen go up. They go up in a day. Some of the fences installed, they're installed in a day. If your declaration says you cannot file suit unless you do so before they finish building, you're going to have some problems, because contrary to that provision in your covenant, state law says you can't file suit unless you've given them 60 days to fix it. And then you can turn it over to a lawyer. So you have to know what's going on with your documents. And if your documents are contrary to the provisions of HB 1137, you're going to have to work with your lawyer for a workaround, because the two are going to conflict and there's no way to meet the requirements of both. So you're going to have to look at both of them. You're going to have to figure out if there's a workaround. You want to be careful that for some of the unique clauses in declarations, right, that can really just sink all your efforts of enforcement, right? I already talked about the bottom one there. No action prior to completion deems it's approved. Approved. It doesn't say you can't sue. It's approved. So now nobody can ever sue on it, because if you didn't file suit prior to completion of the work, it's deemed approved. So you need to make sure if you have that provision in covenants, and then you need to take extraordinary action. Again, working with your lawyer to find a workaround so that you can comply with both 1137 and the statute, right? 1137, the statute, and the declaration. Sorry, I'm confused. You also want to look at some of your documents. There was a period of time, covenants kind of go in waves, right? And I think that goes by the attorneys who are drafting them. But for a long time, some of our older documents had a lot of similar provisions, and that seems to be consistent. And there was a period of time for about, I don't know, 10, 20 years, that we saw all the new covenants come out with a provision that there would be no abatement. That means there's absolutely no self-help by the association. Document clearly states the association waives any right to abate any nuisance. So that means you must send letters, and then you have to file suit. You cannot use any type of self-help. Again, all of these things are document specific. And so you need to remember that what you find in one document is going to be different than what you find in another. And if you have kind of computer programs that help you, you might want to create sections that where you can highlight, hey, this community has this unique section. We need to be aware of it. We need to be careful about it, okay? You need to look to your documents on who has authority to review. I don't know how many times that I have heard from my board members, no, we took this over because it was very touchy and the Architectural Control Committee did not want to deal with it, so they gave it to us to handle. And then I get to say, that's nice, but your documents don't give the board any authority to take that over. Your documents absolutely say that the Architectural Control Committee is in complete control of this issue, and they are the ones who have to make the decision. So you need to send it back down to them, and they need to make that decision. And so you need to look at that, because if you've got a board that took over and started saying, oh no, we're going to handle this because this is really touchy and ACC doesn't want to handle it, they may have put themselves in a very bad position, because the board may have absolutely no authority whatsoever to make that decision. So you need to take a look at that and make sure you know who has authority. You also want to look at some of your provisions on liability. Many governing documents provide there's no liability to the ACC for approving or denying an application, right? McShane versus Sterling Ranch back in 2017 held that that clause only applied to the ACC. It didn't apply to the association, right? Directors have qualified immunity under different sections of the statutes. But again, if you acted contrary to your documents, you might not have that immunity anymore, right? You've got to look very clearly to your documents about who's making the decisions and who has the right to make the decisions, right? Another issue that frequently pops up is, can the ACC delegate, right? Can they hire an expert? And if they hire an expert, can they make the homeowner pay for that expert's time in reviewing the documents? If you hire an expert, are they still bound by those original deadlines? And the answer is almost 90–95% of the time, yes, they're bound by the exact same deadlines. Now, occasionally, you have documents that you get different deadlines, depending on whether or not you can delegate or not. Sometimes your documents might give you authority to extend. Sometimes you can only extend with the owner's approval or agreement. Okay, so you want to look at those things, right? You need to know, can you do these things? Had a question, what if you can't get people to volunteer for the ARC? And then can the board step in? Again, you got to look to your documents. Many documents actually specifically state that the board can do both if they don't have an ARC committee. But then, you know, they need to make some clear distinctions. You know, take off your board member hat, put on your architecture control member hat, act as the ACC, step into those shoes, have minutes of your meeting as the ACC, you know, actually go through the process. You've got to follow your documents to make sure you can do those things. Who's on the committee? Again, these are all document specific, guys. I'm not trying to be vague, but all of these are very clearly pointed out by the declaration. Most committees are appointed by the board of directors, but I have a few communities that actually have homeowners get to vote on the ARC committee, and they get to separately vote for the board. So you got to look to your documents. How do these committees exist? I had one board president many years ago who swore that she and she alone had the authority to appoint the board members. And, you know, we had to work through the bylaw provision that she thought gave her complete control to do that versus what the declaration said. Remember, your bylaws can't contradict your declaration. So even if you have a bylaw that somehow gives just one board member the ability to appoint the committee, you need to look to your declaration and see that it matches that. Because if it doesn't, your declaration always trumps. You know, back to that hierarchy that I said, got to start with the DEC. It is the guiding document in Colorado. And so if your declaration says that the board of directors is appointing the committee, and that means the board is agreeing and appointing a committee. If they are appointed, they work at the discretion of the board. So they can be fired by the board if they're not following the instructions of the board and the covenants. So, you know, you've taken the time maybe to create design guidelines for your community, which I think are awesome because they help your homeowners, they help your community. When we get to court, they help us in court show how we're acting to help our homeowners know what the HOA is going to accept and why. And they help you be consistent. So let's assume we've got those design guidelines in place. And you have a board that has appointed this committee members, and they don't like the guidelines, so they're choosing not to follow them. Well, you can fire them for not following them. Okay. As a board, you need to remember that, in fact, you kind of need to watch them. Right? The buck stops with the board of directors who got voted into office, and so. You know, if the committee is gone rogue, you need to know that. That means you have to watch what they're doing. How many members have to be on the committee? Well, look to your documents. What do your documents say needs to be on the committee? If you don't have enough members, does that mean that their actions are invalid? No, but you should try to keep members, and you need to try and keep members of the ARC, because a lot of your documents suggest, and we'll get to this later on, that if a homeowner doesn't like what the ARC says, they're going to appeal it to the board. Well, if you're in a situation like one of the questions, what happens if you don't have enough homeowners who want to be on an ACC and on the board, and you have just the board acting? Kind of makes appeals invalid, right? Because you got the board, you're going to appeal to the same people who already refused you. That really doesn't work well. So it's always best to try and keep enough people doing both. It gives you some separation between your ARC and your board members, but you know, you don't have to go through all that. If you only have 2 members volunteer, you know, the other thing is sometimes you might want to have one of your board members be the liaison and vote if there's a tie when you have only 2 members and maybe your documents say you should have 3, right? Again, all document specific. Always try and keep your homeowners involved. And I know that's hard. I know that's hard. I'm not trying to kind of hit on a sore point, but the more involvement you can get, the better. How do you know if they're following the covenants, right? Some of my boards have said, well, we're going to demand that all ARC decisions have to be approved by the board. That way we can control what they're doing. We can see what they're doing. Again, got to look to the declaration. Does it give you that authority? You may not have authority to say that. However, that doesn't mean you can't demand that the committee report to you so you know it's happening. Now, you may be stuck with ones that have already been approved, but you can fire them before they make more bad decisions, right? But again, you need to look to what the documents say on whether or not the board can demand to approve all decisions of the ACC, right? Can you overrule an ACC decision? Rarely. Most times, the decision once made is done, especially if the decision has been given to the homeowner. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the things that, you need to think about is there is a provision, it's called estoppel. Estoppel says if me, the homeowner, sends the ACC an application and the ACC says, sure, great, and stamps it, sends it back to me, the minute I buy anything to complete that project, the ACC can't change their mind. I have detrimentally relied upon an ACC approval. I send it to the right person. I got an answer back that was yes, and I spent money, right? It comes up with twists and turns. Sometimes I've had a new manager, accidentally hit approve and send it back, and then the board said, but we don't want that, but it's already been approved. Estoppel will bite, and bite hard. Once there's a signed approval, they get to build it. Okay, it's very, very, very hard, if not impossible, to undo a signed approval. Some of the options that you can take if in fact you have a committee that is not working as they should be is to have a board liaison who sits in on the ACC decisions and can try and help guide them to the direction to comply with the guidelines so they're constantly consistent. Have the ACC and the manager not send out approval decisions until they're, reviewed by the board. Again, the board may not have legal authority to overrule them. So that might be then a matter of you need to fire the entire ACC if they won't agree to comply with the guidelines, and then have the new ACC review that. And remember, your deadlines are still running, right? So this needs to happen very quick. The other thing that you need to remember is that committee process has to be the same as board member process, right? Meaning board members have to have minutes, committee meetings have to have minutes. Committee members have to meet the same requirements of board members. So if your board, if your documents don't specifically give you ability to delegate outside to outsiders, experts, state law may require that those ACC members be members in your community, right? If they take a vote outside of a meeting, they need to keep records of their votes, right? Because many of your documents are going to say it takes a majority of the ACC vote to approve something. So you need to have records to show there was a vote and an approval, right? Many declarations require that if you deny, you need to state why you denied. Okay. Kiowa requires approvals and denials may be inspected. So they need to be kept somewhere. The actual plans are not up for inspection because they're protecting what the owner may have paid to have plans drawn up. And so those aren't up for inspection, but the approval or denial is. So again, you need to keep these in a fashion so that they can be reviewed and addressed. What if the declaration says shall have the right and obligation to maintain, repair? I don't know, I'd have to read the whole document. Again, these are, all of this is document specific. We have an ARC that doesn't meet but conducts all business via email. That's fine, but they have to keep their votes, they have to keep their records, they have to give you something so that you can take a look at them, right? There has to be a record because again, if homeowners send that demand for record inspection and say, I want to look at all the approvals and denials issued by the ARC, Kiowa says they get to do that, right? So homeowners have the right to look at that. That's something that's in the declaration or in Kiowa. So if you're a Kiowa community, those approvals and denials get to be inspected. What are we approving? What is our criteria? Come on, what are we looking for? This is what we get most times. I mean, most of you have seen something like this. Talks about harmony, surrounding areas, will not detract from the beauty, wholesomeness, and attractiveness, right? Very vague. And the question then becomes, How do we determine what that means, right? And I want to suggest to you that the job of the ARC is not to make sure that every home looks like their home. The job of the ARC is to look for things that will cause the property to stand out, and not in a good way, right? The entire community is Victorian in description, and all of a sudden somebody submits to build a tiki hut in the backyard. Well, tiki huts and Victorian don't match. That's not in harmony, right? Tiki hut is going to detract from the beauty of all the old Victorians. It doesn't match, right? But you know, those kinds of things that are just so clear that you can say, no, this doesn't fit our community, are rare, right? It's much more often that you have questions that are much more nuanced. Homeowner wants to paint this yellow, and the ACC doesn't like that yellow. And so then the question is, how did you come to your decision on whether that yellow was an appropriate yellow or not? And we have to go back to, what do your guidelines say, right? Do your guidelines give us help? And that's why guidelines can be so very helpful when you have such a vague statement in your declaration. If the property management company uses software for approvals and denials, is that the documentation you need as proof? Depends. Did you track the votes? Did you make sure that we could see who voted and that everybody voted and it really was a true majority? And is it a document that you can print when you get that request for an inspection of records? You know, look at your review techniques, right? Is there anything in the request that's prohibited, right? It's really simple when you have that request, I want a chain link fence, and your guidelines say no chain link. Well, that one's simple, easy, right? We all get to go, oh, okay, that one's done. No. And, you know, if it's strictly prohibited in the deck, in the guidelines, in the rules, that's just simple, right? We've spelled out those aren't allowed. So it's an easy review technique. You know, the more difficult one is, are there specific requirements for size, color, material, placements? You know, if you have something in your documents that says you can have dog runs, but they can't be in a place that is going to bother the neighbors, and your community is so tight, there's nowhere in the backyard that's not going to bother the neighbors if you have a barking dog. How do you deal with that, right? You have to acknowledge that you're going to have to remember that neighbors have neighbors. That doesn't change simply because they're in an HOA. Any dog in a backyard is going to be heard. So placing the dog run in a place that's least annoying to the neighbors means that maybe when you approve the dog run, you require bushes on the side of the dog run between the edge of the dog run and the neighbor, because the bushes will help absorb any sound. You have to do your best to work within that. Obviously, when you're drafting up design guidelines, kind of think about, is what you're asking in your design guidelines enforceable, right? If your backyards are a postage stamp, don't put in a provision that says, you know, things built in the backyard can't be bothersome to the neighbors. It's a postage stamp. There's no place to adjust in the backyard. If you don't want it in the backyard, don't try and play games by saying it can't be a nuisance to the neighbors when you know there's nowhere to put it in the backyard that won't be a nuisance, right? Don't draft things that are bait and switch. That's just going to make the judge mad at you, right? That's not going to get you anywhere except having a very annoyed judge. Very important. Does the application answer every question about the requirements? Don't ever accept something that doesn't answer every requirement. If someone says, I'm going to build a shed in my backyard, and your backyard requirements for sheds are, can't be more than 120 square feet, can't be a different color than the house, can't be metal, must be within the setbacks or outside the setbacks, or however you want to word it, right? If your submission or application doesn't tell you what the color is, what the size is, what the material they're building it, and where they're putting it, that application didn't answer every question. And the minute you stamped approve without having every answer in that application, you let them do anything they want. And I don't care if they build the ugliest metal shed right next to the fence, if you said okay without asking for those questions. When you said okay to whatever's on that form. If that form didn't spell it out, then they got carte blanche. You have to make them fill out information you care about. Matching the scheme of a community is not the same as being identical. If you want it identical, meaning the house color has to be the shed color, state you want it the exact same color. Matching means different to everyone, okay? It could mean coordinating, it could be similar. Don't assume. When you are looking at applications, do not assume. If you don't have enough information, do not call the owner. There is no record of that phone call. Email the owner if you have a good email and they have been emailing with you already. Remember, there's deadlines running. If your document doesn't say that the timeline doesn't begin until it's complete, your deadline started the day it's sent. And just the fact that you don't have enough information didn't change the deadline. Now, if your deadline said that it starts running when it's complete, when you send an email to the homeowner, you need to say, your submission is incomplete because I don't have these items. I can't make a decision without these items. Until you submit this, we cannot look at the documents, right? So remember your deadlines. If your deadline is on submission and you don't have enough information, send a letter, deny it for being incomplete, tell them you'll reconsider it as soon as they send you a complete information with everything you want. You can make it worded very politely and nicely, but you have to deny it if your deadline is based upon submission. You've got to have it in writing so you have a track record to show to the court, right? Emails will work if they respond to the email. There is a court case, Glen Eagle Civic Association versus Hardin, came out in 2008. It was an ARC application going back and forth by email. The court said, after the homeowner didn't get what he wanted, he of course sued the HOA and said he had never received denials in letters in the mail, which he hadn't. He got it all by email because they had corresponded this entire time via email. And the court found that the email was fine because both parties were answering, going back and forth. And so it was clear the emails were getting through. They were replies and answers. Because you could prove that they got the email because they responded to it, the court said it was valid. But if you send an email and you don't get a response, we can't prove they got it, so we can't prove to the court that the court should accept it. So look at your documents. Most of the time it says denials must be in writing. Approvals must be in writing. So make sure that you're complying with those things so that you're not causing more problems. And just remember that deadline is running. Many, many times I have board members who tell me, oh no, we denied that application because they had open violations. There's nothing in your declaration to support that. If your documents say that you've got 30 days to decide, you don't get to just ignore it because they have another violation. You have to deny it. And then what are you denying it for? Because they have an open violation? That's going to get you an arbitrary and capricious standing of the court. Cannot deny just because they have another open violation. You can't refuse to review it simply because they submitted a form. I've had many cases where that game is the game that the homeowner played. They submitted, got denied, submitted, got denied, submitted, it was ignored. We've already denied that twice. We don't have to do it again. Yes, you do, every single time they submit it, because your declaration says that you will answer and review something within 30 days. And it doesn't say unless it's been submitted twice before. It says you will answer and approve or deny within 30 days. So I don't care how many times they submit it, you have to deny it if you don't want it. Just because they built it first does not mean the timeline and the deadlines don't apply. Just because they've already built it and they submitted to you after they built it, you still have 30 days. If that's what your documents say, that deadline still applies. Don't presume that because they've already violated the covenants, you don't have to follow them, okay? How long is an approval valid? If your documents don't say something, put it in your guidelines. Can't tell you the number of times that I've seen a homeowner submit something, run out of money, hold on to that approval, and 3 years later build it, to the annoyance of the new board who doesn't like what's being built, but the guy's got a signed approval. And if your deadline, or if your documents don't say approvals are only valid for 6 months and then they have to resubmit, or it's only valid for a year and then they have to resubmit, it's valid, right? So if you don't say there's a deadline on it, there's not, okay? Can they appeal? Well, that's up to them and the documents. So many documents talk about appeals from the ARC to the board. That's great. But again, that's why you need a different ARC than a board. Can a neighbor appeal if the homeowner submits and it's approved and the neighbor hears of it and doesn't like it? Can they appeal? Document specific. Got to look to the documents to see if it only gives the appeal right to the owner, or if it gives it to the neighbors too. Don't presume you, the ARC or the board, have the right to go inspect their property to see if they're building it the way you approved it. If your documents do not say you have that inspection right, you do not, okay? Statute of limitations starts running once there's a violation. So when's it a violation? Well, if you denied the shed that he submitted for, the minute he starts building, that violation's ticking. So even if it takes him 1.5 years to build, your statute of limitations is 1 year, and you've got 1 year from when he started building because you denied it, okay? Now, if you approved it so long as it was, 10 feet in from the back fence, and he starts building it against the fence, again, he's in violation of the approval you gave. So your statute of limitations starts running the minute he started digging right next to the fence, right? Because you could tell that he's digging in a place different than where you approved it. Okay. If he starts building so far and it looks good and it looks like he's building it right, and you're watching him build, and all of a sudden it's twice the size, it's going to be really it's going to be very difficult in court to tell when he started that building beyond what you approved. So you're going to need the evidence of when you last looked so we can tell the court we filed within 1 year from when we could tell it was bigger than what we agreed to, okay? Again, your documents, it has to comply with whatever the requirements in the document. Who can file, when they can file. There's no statutory right of appeal, okay? There's not. So if it's not in the document, it doesn't exist. And you don't have to give them that right in your design guidelines if it's not in your declaration. Again, there's no right to that outside of whatever your declaration states. Again, the notice is going to be specific as to who can handle it, okay? Remember, if you have tenants and they start building, you need to reach out to the owner, not the tenant who's building, because it's the owner who's responsible and going to be fined for this, okay? Variances. Lots of people ask for them, and boards presume they have the right to give them, and they don't unless their document specifically states so. And once again, you need to look to your documents of who has that variance authority. Many times, the variance authority is in the ACC. It's not in the board, okay? Look to your documents. They should be really sparely used, if ever. What have I seen as valid variances? If you've ever taken a class from me, you've probably heard me say a requirement of 2 trees in the front yard, and because of easements and the shape of the yard, you can't fit 2 trees. So you make them have one in the front yard and the other one has to go in the backyard and add it to the backyard number. That's an appropriate variance for you, for the rules. You're granting the variance because of the topography, not because, oh, I didn't bother to read, I missed that quotient. Oh, can I have a variance? I'm sorry. Okay, not a good reason to give a variance. Because then everybody who comes forward and says, oh, I didn't read it, can I have a variance? You need to do it, because you have to be consistent. When you give a variance, you have to, everybody who comes up in the same position afterwards has to get the variance too. So be very sparing when you give variances. What do you do when an ACC member wants to file an application? Do you have somebody else who can step in? Do you have your documents to let a board member fill in on the ACC to take that spot of the ACC member who wants to do something to their own yard? You should have provisions. You should be able to talk to everybody about these kinds of conflicts. They happen all the time. What happens when you hire a professional and he's reviewing all the plans that are coming in because you're still building out in your community, and all of a sudden the professional is the one submitting to build on his lot, right? Kind of a conflict because he can't review what he just designed. Look at these things, stay on top of these things. These are conflicts and they're going to pop up. When do you send the violation notice? Okay, you've got to look at your documents. Some of your documents state, if in fact, once there's non-compliance, here's the steps to take. If that's the situation, follow that non-compliance provisions and process that's in the declaration. If your declaration doesn't speak to it, you start following your covenant enforcement process the minute you see a deviation from the plans that were approved or the denial that you sent. And then you shift from the ACC process to your covenant enforcement process. And now we're on that 1137 track where you've got to send the notices, you've got to give them time, and you need to remember, now we're no longer in the 30-day deadlines. We're in the 30-day to fix it deadlines of 1137. Now we're under a different set of rules. And at the same time that this is happening, since something has been built, statute of limitations is ticking. So once again, no delays, keep tracking every timeline that's coming in, because now we got a different statute that's ticking in the background. So every time there's a request for an extension or a little more time, statute of limitations is still ticking. I don't really care that they ask for more time. You've got to get that lawsuit filed. If you don't get the lawsuit filed, it's going to be there. Okay. So kind of be in mind that you've got two different processes and you have to follow what the deck says, right? I kind of already covered this. When's it finished? It's not when it's finished. The answer is, when did you know? It's not what was approved, right? Have to comply with the specifics of the documents, have to give them the timeline that's in your documents plus 1137 timelines. I have a lot of documents that talk about the non-compliance must give 45 days to fix. You have to let that 45 days pass before you can jump into your 1137 30-day notice. So make sure that you're tracking what your guidelines in your deck says and then tracking the next ones. Hearings. Okay, we're in the violation status, right? So now we're talking covenant enforcement. Are they open to members? No, the law changed. These are held in executive session, right? Can you allow the complaining neighbor to be present? Look at your documents. Again, you want to be very careful about limiting to as few as necessary, because you want to make sure that you're not causing more problems. If your documents talk about allowing the complaining party present in the hearing, then they can be there. But again, you don't want to open it up for the entire community, because 1137, when it went through, closed hearings to just members. I use this to remind everybody, this is a story out of California. It is a true story. This gentleman was building a 2-story house. In his community, views were guaranteed. The guy's view that was being blocked filed suit and made this guy take off an entire upper floor level that blocked his view. So this is the remodeled house. It's now only 1 floor, and this is the view that the gentleman who won the lawsuit gets to see for the rest of his days. He might be able to see over the house because it's now only 1 story, but he knows exactly what his neighbor thought of him for having sued and made him take off the 2nd story. You will still live next to these people. Even if you have to sue them, they will still be in the community. So remember, if you can resolve it before it gets to that, all the better. These are the standard defenses, and we covered the really important ones. One of the most important ones, obviously, is statute of limitations, right? 1 year. So the date you knew that they were building different than you approved, or building even though you denied it, you need to stop them. Let me go through some of these questions. Somebody asked who can review the approvals or denials? Homeowners, and that's under the inspection of records policy. So follow the policy that you have to have as part of Kiowa. Can the board and management review and approve? Again, it's document specific. If your declaration says it's an ACC decision, the manager's got no business being in a review process. That's a board. It's not a board decision either. It's the ACC. If the process doesn't say ARC or ACC, it's still saying the association will approve or deny. So again, you can clarify that by design guidelines. If guidelines say the color of the house must be earth tone, is that too vague? Yes, unless you really like bright blue, because I had a lawsuit where the homeowner assured me that blue was an earth tone because the sky is part of the earth, and therefore bright blue is an earth tone. I do not recommend, I can't talk. I do not recommend earth tone being a designation. If the property management company uses software, oh, I already covered that one, sorry. What if a proximate neighbor strongly objects to a decision of the ARC? That is completely dependent upon whether or not your declaration allowed the neighbors to appeal. If the neighbors aren't allowed to appeal, and if you've already approved it, you've given it to the neighbor or to the homeowner who submitted it, estoppel will prevent you from changing your mind, right? Estoppel really says if you've said yes, there's not anything that the homeowner needs to do. He went to the people who he's supposed to go to. He got the signed approval. He gets to build it. Whether the neighbor likes it or not doesn't matter. Even if the HOA screwed up, the homeowner who asked to build it gets to build it. Now, the HOA may be on the hook to the neighbor if they screwed up. If the documents say no chain link fence, and you signed off and said to this homeowner, go ahead and build the chain link fence, the HOA may get sued for breach of fiduciary duty for not following their own documents, but the homeowner still gets to build it because he did the right thing. He submitted it and you approved it. May the ARC require an application even if a minor remodel? Again, completely document specific. Some documents say any alteration must be approved. Some say if a structure is built, it must be pre-approved. Well, a structure being built isn't a remodel of something that's already being built, that's already there. So you're gonna have to look to your documents. What does it say? Processes for high rises are very, very difficult because one, they're interior, and many times nobody even knows they're doing it, right? And the neighbors might know because they hear the banging, but otherwise the board may not know if they don't live in any of the surrounding units to the house or the unit doing remodeling. High rises really, again, document specific. I have a community in Colorado Springs. Document says that it's a condo community. So of course, owners only own airspace, but for the purpose of remodels, owners are allowed to remodel any wall that's not structural, and there was no pre-approval required. So then it became, how do you know what they're doing in there, right? There was, we won't know if it's structural because there was no inspection rights. There's no ability to know. So again, you have to go to your document and see, does it give you any inspection rights? Does it give you any ability to look into it? Can we send a cease and desist or stop work order if we find work being done that's not approved? Sure, you can send it. But again, those are great words, but they don't have any legal meaning, right? There's no legal significance to the letter that says, hey, stop, or it says, hey, cease and desist. It's the same letter. I mean, it doesn't matter. It doesn't, one is not legally stronger in court. It's just a word that means stop. Sometimes you can look to the counties. Douglas County is awesome. Douglas County actually has, as part of their application and permitting process, did you get HOA approval? And if they check yes, and then the HOA contacts the county and says they did not, this is not allowed, Douglas County will go put a stop work order on their site. So look to your counties, talk to your counties, see if they have that. I believe there's more than just Douglas County that does that, but look to your counties because sometimes they will stop them for you. Do we need to disclose complainants to homeowner during a hearing? So I get this a lot where the HOA wants to protect the neighbor. Guys, if you go to court, I got news for you. The neighbor has to be a witness. And if they're not willing to step up now, it's coming out later. And why do you wait until you're in the middle of a lawsuit spending thousands of dollars when had you disclosed it early on, maybe it wouldn't have? Quit trying to hide the neighbors from the homeowner. If in fact there's a complaint, again, an owner should be able to see who complained against them. Do you have to volunteer it? No, but if they ask, provide it. It's not good. It doesn't look good in court. If a violation is sent for paint and has 30 days to comply, but ARC is submitted after the violation and ARC approval gives 12 months to complete, I mean, that means that you sent a letter, dear homeowner, you've started to paint without approval. The minute they submitted the ARC, they fixed the 30-day failure to comply with the ARC process. So now they have the 12 months to complete. So again, you need to kind of look at what you've got. Can an HOA institute parking rules? We're not really talking about parking, and parking is document specific, and parking rules now have to comply with all the towing laws that just came out. Can an HOA require backyard landscape and inspections by the ARC? It's called trespass, folks. If I own my property, it's my property. If there's not easement rights in your declaration, you don't have a right to just add that into the ARC rules. It's got to be in the declaration that says that the HOA ARC can go inspect it while it's being built. Not the deck, can't do it. If the documents are silent on an ARC, no. That you don't have to create an ARC. The board, I mean, again, does your document say any building must be pre-approved? If it says any building must be pre-approved, then you have to have somebody who's going to pre-approve it. So you're going to have to create a committee if you want. HOAs can create committees at their leisure. That's in the Nonprofit Act, so if they want to. Or if the board themselves wants to act as the ARC, they can do it. But the association is driven by the board. So if your document says there must be pre-approval to any building, then your board or committee the board creates is going to have to review it. If your documents don't say pre-approval is required, then homeowners don't need pre-approval. Can the ACC require agreement and approval from neighbors before approval is given? I don't recommend it. All you're doing at that point, look, you, the board, have the obligation to enforce the covenants. You, the board, have the obligation to approve or deny. If you start making your neighbors go and get permission from their buddies on both sides, look, I know all the neighbors that I live around. I want to have a tiki hut, and my house is an old Victorian. My neighbors come over to my backyard and they want to party in the tiki hut too. So me getting an approval from my both neighbors and bringing it to the board means nothing, because everybody else in the community can still sue the HOA if you approve my tiki hut. The board's duty is to enforce the covenants and enforce the design guidelines. The fact that my neighbors like me and say yes didn't make my application better or worse. You shouldn't require signatures from neighbors it just causes more difficult. Stick with having the fact that you have design guidelines that say when you're going to approve something, which is when it's in harmony. And then you set forth what it's in harmony. You put it in your design guidelines. If you're concerned that colors are an issue in your community, go to the nearby Sherwin-Williams and have them create a color book. Tell homeowners, these are the pre-approved colors in our color book. If you want something different than these pre-approved colors, you're going to have to paint it on your garage door, and it's going to have to be there for 2 weeks for every homeowner in the community to come and object to us or not, and then we'll consider it. And we still may deny it even if we don't get objections, because then it's completely at the discretion of the current ACC. But make it clear, right? What you don't want is sending a letter saying, dear homeowner, you didn't submit before you started building that shed in your backyard, when you know sheds aren't allowed. If the shed's not allowed, don't say, dear homeowner, you didn't submit for it. Say, dear homeowner, you're building something that's not allowed. Setting somebody up to do something that you haven't, that you know you're not going to allow them to do, will just get you in trouble with the courts. So I think I hit the end of my time, and I think I got through all the questions. So thank you very much for attending, and have a great day.